Hey there, it's me, Laura with Bold Notion Quilting, an IQ and APQS sales rep here in Central Florida, and I would like to show you one way to set up your pantographs when you're working on your IntelliQuilter robotic system. So I am going to turn on my IQ. Let's go back to the main menu. Okay, it starts on the main menu, and I'm going to design Sew Quilt. I'm going to start a new quilt because I haven't set anything up yet, and it asks me if I have a work in progress, do I want to replace it? If it's nothing I need to worry about, I click yes, I'll erase it. Do you want to erase permanently or save the work in progress to the catalog? Again, it's nothing I care about, so I'm going to erase it. But if the last thing that you had on here you need to save or go back to, this is where you'd want to save it. Make sure you don't get rid of it, okay? It tells me what my last project time was, and I'll just click reset. And at the top, my project time goes to 0 hours and 0 minutes. Keeping track of your project time can be helpful when you're trying to figure out how much to charge for the service that you're providing. So it says add a pattern or a block. Select the pattern type or block that you want to add. So I want to add a pantograph. I like to do this where I set up my entire pantograph all together because I'm a type A personality and I want to see how much farther on that quilt that I have left. So for me, this is what I like to do. I'm going to enter the rectangle manually, and then you're going to take the measurements of the quilt. My quilt is 68 by 68 inches square. So at this point, I get in the habit of putting my machine to the back left-hand corner of my quilt top, and I keep it an inch outside of and an inch above the outside perimeter edges of my quilt, okay? I align my needle to the top left-hand corner of my quilt top, just outside of my quiltable space, because as soon as I click finished on that, entering my width and entering my height, my IntelliQuilter is going to think that the top left-hand corner of my quilt is wherever my needle is in my quiltable space. So if my machine is close to me or somewhere off to the right, as soon as I click finish, the top left-hand corner of my quilt is justified to where the needle is sitting. And sometimes that is really inconvenient for me. So I get in the habit of moving that needle to the top left-hand corner so that as soon as I enter in the width and enter in the height, hit continue and hit finished, it aligns to that top left-hand corner right where I want it to be. From there, I can just fill in the designs and continue. You can always make your quilt design, your digital design, bigger, and I recommend that your quilt design that you make is always bigger than your quilt top, regardless, okay? Because you can always cut it down. It's a lot harder to add inches to it, okay? So heed that advice from one beginner to another, all right? So I'm gonna make my width 72 inches. I'm gonna make it, 3 inches too big. And I'm gonna make my height 72 inches. Or I guess that's 5 inches too big. And I'm in the top left-hand corner. I've got 2 inches on this side. I'm an inch above. And then I'll have some inches on the other side. So I'm going to hit enter for my width, enter for my height. My machine is up in the top left-hand corner. When I hit continue, it automatically aligns that quilt to the top left-hand corner of my screen. Okay? So it's automatically aligned it to the top left-hand corner of my screen. Next, this is where it tells me to verify my data. I can move my machine around and you see how that quilt is kind of locked on those crosshairs. Once I clicked finished, it takes me to my catalog and it'll take me to whatever my most recent catalog is. I'm always in my downloads because that's where all of my patterns end up and I never go back and move them around. So I'm in my downloads and I'm gonna pick my first pattern. So it says select a catalog, so I can pick whatever catalog I want to look. I'm going to click downloads and it says touch the pattern you want to use on your odd rows. So the pattern I want to use on my odd rows, 1, 3, 5, 7, 57, whatever, is going to be synchronicity. And then I hit continue. Now I can select a pattern that I can use on my even rows. As long as the patterns are designed in similar ways, they should nest okay. But it's hard to tell if they're going to work until you select them both. So I selected one to fit in my even rows. I'm going to flip my X, see how I like that. I'm going to flip my Y, see if I like that better. Sometimes when you put patterns in here, it's hard to tell what they're going to look like until you kind of get in there and start moving them around. And the coolest function that I like, this one actually pulled it in pretty close together. You can actually use what's called a gap, and that's going to set the space between your rows. So you can make them closer together or farther apart, which is going to impact how well they nest. Okay, so we're going to pull them closer together. You can actually zoom in to see how detailed they are nesting together because it's hard to tell when you're not zoomed in. And I actually like that gap percent. My row height is 12 inches. So I'm not sure, every time it brings in a pattern, it is at 12 inches. And I'm not sure how dense this actually is because I'm zooming. So if I go to zoom and if I click true size zoom and then click somewhere on my pattern, this is the actual size of my quilting design, so I can see how it's going to be stitched out. I like that. It's about 1.5 inches apart. I feel pretty comfortable with that. The smallest part is probably about 3/4 of an inch apart, so I'm going to zoom out just to kind of see what it all looks like together. And I like how well this looks and it's put together. So we're great. We've got a big old pattern. We've adjusted our gap. There are other buttons that you can hear that you have here that can do many other things, but this is a beginner, let's get us started tutorial, so we're not going to touch those. Okay, offset just changes your pattern on just your, I want to say your odd rows. Yeah, it moves them left or right by a percentage, and you can move them manually with these arrows or by swiping. Shift will move just your odd rows up or down. Okay. We're going to do offset at 0. I just messed up my own pattern. We're going to put shift, and unfortunately you can't just like put in 0 for this one. I wish I could just put an amount. So we'll just get it close. Okay. Skew is actually going to stretch your pattern bigger or smaller, so you can actually make things farther apart or not. And then clip off, it basically is allowing it to repeat. If you put clip on, it doesn't repeat all the way across. Okay, it just kind of clips it off at the end. Okay, so you just want that clipping function off so that it doesn't clip the edge of it off. So I like the way that it looks, and I'm going to go ahead and click finished. Transition type on the clipping confirmation page, continuous, is just explaining to me how it's going to stitch along the edge. I always like to let it stitch continuous because the outer edge of my quilt is in my batting area somewhere. So if it stitches a hard orange line, that doesn't matter so much. Okay, so if we look at the edge of our quilt, if we change our transition type to jump stitch, okay, it's going to have a green line. When I see this green line as a transition between rows, I know that my machine is going to stitch that area, stop stitching, move the machine head, and then continue stitching, which results in longer stitches here. You can change the threshold of how far apart your jump stitches are, which will either increase or decrease the amount of jump stitches that you get. Okay. Same idea for a tie-off. A tie-off is just like a jump stitch, except the machine stops stitching and then it calls you to come look at it and to do something with it. It beeps at you to come get your attention. So for all intents and purposes, we're just going to do continuous because I like it to stitch that way. And we're going to hit accept. Do you want to commit to these transitions? You will not be able to change them later. Yes, I'm okay with that. So it's giving us options on the Design Sew quilt screen to kind of see or manipulate this pattern before we get to our final stages of stitching. I'm going to click Sew Quilt, and it tells me to select the first pattern to quilt. It starts on my left with an S1 and it ends on my right with an E1. I'm going to hit continue. I then have the option to manually select each row if I want to. Select the next pattern to quilt. Okay. And I hit continue once I've selected it. And it wants to know if I want to sew continuously from this row end to the next row end, if I want it to stop and cut my threads between the rows, or if I want it to do a jump stitch between the rows. Because these rows are 12 inches and I cannot stitch 2 sets of these rows, I'm actually going to tell it to stop to cut the threads, which is a blue line, which means when it finishes this row, it's going to beep at me and it's going to give me the opportunity to advance my quilt. I can do this for every single row by clicking the next row that I want to go to. Continue, stop to cut threads, or I can click Panto Sequencing Assistant, tell it what to do for every single row. It's going to stitch left to right. How do you want the rows quilted? Left to right. How do you want to use continuous stitching? Do you want to use continuous stitching, tie off, or jump stitch? I'm going to have it tie off so that for every row it comes and calls me. I can tell it to do it for just one row by clicking next, or the entire quilt to do the whole thing. Okay, if I had just clicked the done button, it would have only done whatever row that I was touching. Next, I can tell it to sew the quilt. On the adjust sequence screen, okay, you want to make sure to have that enabled. If you don't have this screen popping up here, you want to click on sew quilt and then click this little gear and click adjust start stop disabled and make sure that it's enabled. And so it's going to bring up these dashed lines, show you where the safe space for the machine to move is, and these dashed lines, and you can actually drag them and adjust them. So I made my quilt top 5 inches bigger. I can actually pull these lines in to get it closer to the edge of my quilt top, so I'm not stitching 2.5 inches off the edge and wasting that batting and that fabric. And when I get down to the end, I can also adjust at the bottom to cut off the row and sew across the bottom too, which is pretty cool. If I move my machine head around, these green crosshairs are actually going to move around the quilt top, and it's going to show me if my machine actually aligns with the left side and the right side of my quilt top, so I know that if I'm in the right quiltable space. If for some reason my quilt grows towards the end and gets bigger, I can just click on adjust and move that line out so that it makes my pattern continue further on to the right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click finished. Please set the stitch regulated length and continue, and then we're going to start stitching from here. So once I hit finished, when I went to check that dashed line over there, it moved the machine all the way over for me. I don't have a whole lot of patience to wait for it to do that function, so a lot of times before I hit finish, once I've checked my dashed line on my adjust screen to make sure everything fits, I'll actually pull my machine over here and then I'll click finish, so it only has to move about an inch or two where it needs to be. So once I hit finish, it moved to where I wanted to go to start one, okay? And it says, please set the regulated stitch length or constant speed on the quilting machine and hit continue. So I'm going to continue because I'm telling it, okay, I'm going to check those features right now and I'm going to adjust them. On the left side, you can see that you've got speed with up and down arrows and details with up and down arrows. I know where my machine likes to stitch. You actually want to, when you first get your IntelliQuilter system, play with it and adjust the speed and details up and down, depending on how much your machine head actually vibrates the tablet back and forth. You're trying to measure that harmonic vibration. You want to find that sweet spot where when your machine does quilting, your tablet actually doesn't rock back and forth. When your tablet rocks back and forth a lot, it jostles the connectors, and then it can create weak connection points, which give you all kinds of errors, and then it doesn't work properly the way that it should. So make sure that when you're quilting, you're not quilting with it constantly vibrating. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my speed and my details, and they're within 0.2 of each other. My machine actually likes to either stitch really fast or really slow. There's a huge space in between where it vibrates a lot. So I usually stick with the faster stitching speed for all over pantographs that are close to one another, that are like 12 inches apart, right? I turn off my stitch regulator and I increase my stitch length to match that of my speed. You can then check your dwell points. Dwell is when it gets to a specific area of the pattern where it has a little orange dwell node, and so usually that's on points if you have stars or curl points or whatever, and actually stops and it slows down when it gets there, so it puts extra stitches and it makes it extra pointy, which is awesome for your star but terrible if you have to rip out. So I'm going to check and make sure that my dwell is set to 1 because this is a pretty curvy pattern. I could turn dwell off completely. It only has 3 levels. 3 is the pointiest and off is the roundest. Okay. I can tell my IntelliQuilter to show my dwell points or turn them off. So if you ever turn on your IntelliQuilter and you have a bunch of orange dots everywhere, it's just showing your dwell points. You can turn them off on that gray bar at the top. So now that I've set my stitch length, I'm going to go ahead and tell it to start. And once it starts stitching, I'm actually going to pay attention to it and see if I like the stitch length. My stitches look a little long, so I'm going to move the amount of stitches per inch up. I'm going to increase them. Still looking a little long. If my tablet were vibrating, or if my machine head were vibrating, or if my thread were breaking, I'd probably adjust all of that down so it's not stitching so fast. But I do enjoy that I can stitch with my machine quickly and I have no problems with it. It's the beauty of my IQ and my APQS. So we're just going to watch this stitch the first row so that I can show you what to do once it comes to a tie-off point. I ran out of thread, so this begs the question of what do I do now that I've run out of my thread? So I stopped it because I saw that my thread stopped stitching. Okay, it would have stopped on its own when it realized that the sensor wheel wasn't moving. Okay, and I'm actually going to tell it to restart. So it thinks that it stitched a lot more than it should have. So it thinks that it stitched here, because this is red, all the way down here. That's why I was a little confused, right? But it didn't have a chance to come back here because it never finished off its thread over there. So I'm going to take my bobbin out. I'm going to take out the empty bobbin. I'm going to put in the new full bobbin. Click it in. And the beauty of quilting off the edge of your quilt is that you really could, put your knots and your starts and stops off to the edge. Otherwise, I usually start 5 or 6 stitches back on my line. And it's free flowing enough that it's fine. I want to get my needle right over where it should be, and if you put your needle down, you can back up a little bit on the line, hit OK, because I hit restart. I move my needle to the place that I wanted it to restart. I tack down my threads, and then I'm going to click start, and it should forward stitch over what I just back stitched there by locking everything in. You have to wait till it's done beeping to be able to move it freely. Restart gives me the option to move anywhere in my quiltable space where my machine can sense where these lines are. I move my crosshairs to the line that I want it to restart on. I tack my threads, and then I tell it to start, okay? And so that lets me restart if I break a thread or there's some kind of obstruction and I need to start my threads over again. I'm going to click restart, move my needle to the place that I need it to go, and then I'm going to keep stitching, all right? So restart just allows me to make it forget where it's already quilted, start somewhere else, and then continue the sequence going forward. Now that I have finished a row though, let's say nothing went wrong and I stitched all my threads all the way across and I've finished my row, I now need to do what's called realign. So when it beeped, it told me to move my machine to the next restart point and hit start. Now, while the IQ, the intelligent quilter, is pretty intelligent, it can't roll the quilt sandwich up for me, okay, and it can't know where to restart next. If that update ever comes out, I'll be the first in line. Alright, so our threads are cut, our needle is out of the quilt sandwich. I'm going to move my machine over. I'm going to advance it up until the edge of my design is within a few inches of my leveler bar, okay? Alright, then I need to realign my quilt to a point. So the only thing that's on here is the option to start. If I click start, this red stuff that it's already stitched that used to be right here, my IntelliQuilter doesn't know has been rolled up. So if I just hit start and I don't realign, it tries to move my machine so much farther than it can go, and it's going to give an obstruction error. And that's a beep. Hey dummy, come look at me, obstruction error. So instead, I'm going to realign it, okay? And I've left enough quilting visible in my top couple inches that I have a point that I can realign to. Now what I will say is that there is nothing on this pattern that gives me a cross point to line my needle up with. So I'm either gonna have to use my best judgment or do it with the start and stop on the end. Typically, for most patterns, you'll wanna align to a point on the middle. But if you take a look at this pattern, there are 0 points. Everything is rounded and nothing has an actual point to it. So, in order to be the most accurate, I'm going to align this one to its last stitching point up here at the top where I cut the threads. I'm going to hit zoom, and I'm going to zoom in to that end one. I'm going to line it up to this last stitching point at the bottom where my needle is hovering right over that point. If you have a laser with your robotic system, that's fantastic. And then I'm going to zoom in all the way to that end one point. Zoom off. That green line is showing where my needle is. If I move my machine left or right, that green line moves. So I'm going to put my needle over the actual quilted spot, and then I'm going to touch where my needle is. So it says touch a reference point on the screen. I like to move my needle there first so I don't mess this up. Then I touch the point on the screen, and then I hit continue. Move the needle to the location of the reference point and touch OK. We're already there, so I'm going to hit OK. What that ended up doing, if you noticed, my line was about 1/4 of an inch to the left in the screen. Might have just been a few stitch widths. What's going to happen is you're going to find that when it stitches this side, it's actually going to pull it over just a little bit to the left. So it moved my machine over to the start point, and I tacked off my threads just so that they're locked in place, and then I hit OK. And now it's going to stitch my second row. From here, we are just going to continue to let it stitch its rows, advance the quilt, realign the quilt, and let it stitch each row over and over again until we get to the very end. And then I'm going to show you how to adjust the bottom edge of your quilt simply so that you can cut it off and finish the final part of your quilt. Alright, so my machine finished sewing its last final row that it could fit. I have another 5 or 6 inches, which is only going to be about half a row, until I get to the end of my quiltable area of my quilt top, but also to my quiltable space. So what I'm going to do, it says to finish the row, it says cut the threads and touch start. I don't have to realign my final row because I stitched this whole row already, and this is still within this quiltable space. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit start, so that way it lets me see the rest of my my menu. I hit stop because it's going to try to go too far downward that it's not actually going to, it's going to hit an obstruction and give me an error. So I'm going to click adjust. Adjust is when we cut off stuff with those dashed lines. And then I'm actually going to touch the bottom dashed line. And I'm going to bring my machine down, okay? So I'm going to touch this bottom dash line. I've brought my machine down to the edge of my quiltable space, just past the edge of my quilt top, which you can see here. So just past the edge of my quilt top. I know that my quilt is nice and straight, but I can always check it to see. All right, and I'm going to click on the adjust line, and I'm going to click snap to needle. cool function, but if you move the machine back, it continues to snap to the needle. So I click snap to needle, and you can't push it again to unhighlight it, which is weird. So I'm just gonna hit arrow down so it comes a smidge down, but now when I move the machine, it doesn't try to snap the dash line to the needle. So now I'm just gonna check that this bottom line that it's gonna stitch down is gonna catch all the rest of my quilt top, and that my quilt isn't, you know, totally askew or out of line, because this isn't the straightest quilt I've ever pieced, right? So I know that all of it's gonna fit in that space, and I've adjusted that line up. So now my IntelliQuilter is only gonna quilt these bottom 6 inches. So I'm gonna click finished. When you click finished, it goes to the restart screen. And so you can see here on my tablet that it actually has a new start location for 6. And instead of that start location being on the edge here where it was, it's actually down about 6 inches in and to the right. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna tack off my threads. At the restart location. And I'm just gonna click OK and let it start stitching. Thank you all for watching today's video. I sure hope that it was helpful for you in learning how to set up pantographs on your own. If you could please give a like, thumbs up, comment, share below. That will let YouTube share this video with more people and just let us know that we're providing this information for you guys to check out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care and happy quilting. Bye!